In the first part of our module, we covered the regular verbs for using lu as a paradigm for the first aorist indicative forms. Here we're going to go over more verbs and go over the first aorist indicative forms, but note that for these verbs as follow, we have to make some adjustments to the verb, what I like to call a small tweak to the verb in order for us to get the first aorist indicative forms. For with contract verbs, what's the one tweak you have to do? You have to remember that for whether it's an alpha, epsilon, or omicron contract verb, where when you drop the omega, the stem ends in a short vowel. All of these short vowels undergo compensatory lengthening. So the alpha goes long to an eta, the epsilon goes long to an eta, and the omicron goes long to omega. I'm not listing the entire paradigm. I am writing only the first person singular forms because I assume if I write the first person singular form, you'll be able to write the rest of the paradigm, the second person singular, third person singular, and all the plural forms. So here is just the first person singular for the active and the first person singular for the middle. So how would I form, how would I say I loved? With agapao, I augment the alpha, so that's an eta, that's my augment. I add the stem or the verbal root, so aga, pa, but this alpha here undergoes compensatory lengthening. It becomes an eta. And then you add the sa tense formative plus the suffix endings, and agapesa is how I say I loved. And I assume that if you have this first person singular form, you can write agapesas, agapese or sen, agapesamen, agapesate, agapesan. And you'll be able to write all the other forms. And how do I say I myself loved, which is the aorist, first person singular aorist middle form? I have the augment a, add the stem, and the compensatory lengthening. The short vowel goes long, and I add the middle suffixes, which is sa plus main, and agapesa main is I myself love. What about akaluteo? Same deal, add the augment, then add the stem, and then this epsilon here, it goes under compensatory lengthening, and then you add the suffixes. So ekaluthesa is I followed, and if I want to write the middle form, I again add the augment, the stem, compensatory lengthening, and the tense formative plus the suffix, and ekaluthesamen is I myself followed. For the omicron contracts, you add the augment, and here it's an epsilon because it's not a vowel that begins the stem, but a consonant. So play, and since this is an omicron here, we've compensatory lengthened it to omega. So play ro sa is I filled, I complete, and play ro sa main is I myself fulfilled or completed. And those are the forms for the contract verbs. For verbs that have a stop at the end of the stem, that means they're either velars, bilabials, or dentals. And remember the square stops. Please review the square stops if you forget how those work, because we'll be using them here. The trick about the verbs that end with a stop, whether they're velar, bilabial, or a dental stop at the end of the stem, is to remember as part of your vocabulary whether the verbal root is the same or it's different. So with blepo, for example, we know that the verbal root's the same. It's just blep. But for baptizo, you have learned after our module on chapter 20, and you went back and reviewed the verbal roots for all your vocabulary, the verbal root for baptize is actually baptid with a dental, so it's a dental. Didask has a big change. Even though didasko is the lexical form, its verbal root is didog. A new vocabulary word, keruso, which is I preach, its verbal root is kerug. Sozo, its verbal root is sowed without the iota subscript. So while the lexical form has the iota subscript, it drops with the verbal root. Doxazo has doxad. Arco has the same verbal root as the stem, so there's no change here. And proseuchomai has the same stem as the verbal root. So proseuchomai remains the same, arco remains the same, and blepo here remains the same, but the rest of them, which is common with stops, have a different verbal root than the lexical form. And remember, when we form the aorist tense, you're using the verbal root to form the tense. That you use the lexical form only with the present and the imperfect forms, the present and the imperfect forms, and you'll want to use the verbal root for everything else. So let's go over again the first person singular forms for the aorist active and first person singular forms for the aorist middle forms, assuming that if we just list out the first person singular form, you'll be able to get the second person singular, third person singular, and all the plural forms by following the Luo paradigm. So what about blepo? You add the epsilon, you add the stem. Now look what's happening here. You add the sa tense formative to it, and remember your square stops. What happens when a P and a sigma combine? According to your square stops, it becomes a psi. P plus sigma, or a bilabial plus sigma, gives you a psi. So the final form to say I saw is a blepsa, and where you don't see the P or the sigma, but they have combined to form the psi according to the square of stops. Let's clear that up, and I'll just do really quickly the aorist middle form. It'll follow the same pattern, where the one tweak is to remember the square of stops. So you add the augment, you add the stem, but instead, when I add the P to the sa tense formative, I'm going to get a blepsa plus the middle suffix endings, main, and I get a blepsa main. So we just did an example using a bilabial, blepo, but what about a dental with baptizo? I take the epsilon, augment, I add to baptide, which is the verbal root, and when I add sa to it, what happens when a dental and a sigma combine? Well, the dental drops, remember, and it just becomes a sigma. So the final form is e baptissa, which is I baptize. So this is I baptized. And let me clean this up. So that's an example of a dental. But what if we have a velar? Well, I take my augment, and for the first aorist, I add the velar stem. But here, when a gamma is added to the sa tense formative, we know that from the square of stops, a velar plus sigma equals a kasi. So it's edidosksa, and that's I taught. So you go ahead and fill the rest of the paradigm. The only thing I want to remind you of is proseuchomai, because remember your rules for augments, that pros is a preposition, and it's been combined with a verbal stem to form a compound verb. And so look where the augment is. This is a lesson that you learned before when you first introduced augments, but this is just a friendly reminder. I write the preposition, I augment the diphthong, I have key here. This is combined with the sigma, so this is another example of the velar. And so this will combine to a kasi. So the final form is pros sux sa main. This is a middle form. Because it's a middle form, you actually do not have an active form here. So this active part will be left blank because this is a deponent verb. Proseuchomai is a deponent verb, and therefore it only has middle forms. And so proseuxamein is I prayed. But the rest of these will all have, the rest of these examples will all have an active form and a middle form. So you go ahead and fill this out on your own. So pause the video, please pause the video, and fill out the rest of the chart on your own, and then we'll come back. So I'm hoping you paused the video. Are you ready for the answers? Here we go. Okay, so this is how I filled out the rest of the paradigm. Please compare what you wrote on your paradigm chart with what you see on the screen and go on to the next instructional video.